Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric. You asked for it, so I'm going to be doing it. When I talked about the Sega Neptune PCB from Kosam the Great, a recreation Sega Neptune that never released back in the day, everyone commented down below and said, you need to build one on camera, so that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. Today is the intro video, then I'm going to go over the PCB, talk all about the project, what this thing actually does, and kind of break down just how much of a metric crap ton of work this is. Because when we talk about the Sega Neptune, we're talking about a combination Sega Genesis and 32X, all on the same PCB. And a few people I know, including Anton Gale, who sent me one of his backup PCBs for this video, have made the board and it is functioning, so we know it works perfectly fine. You just need to have the talent and ability to actually assemble the thing. And when I say this build is complex, I 100% mean it. This is basically doing pick and place machinery work in a factory by hand, and you'll see here on this PCB as I go over it, it has an absolute metric crap ton of things you actually need to populate, and you need to do it probably in the right order, building from low to high, at least in my opinion. Now, obviously this thing is going to be a Sega Genesis. You're going to be able to pop any original Sega Genesis cart into it, or Paprium, because that's the footage I had on my hard drive without having to capture more, and it's going to function exactly like any Sega Genesis would. But additionally, you can pop a 32X cartridge into the slot, and you'll also have a full 32X on board. One cartridge slot, two systems, just like Sega planned on it back in the day before they canceled the system. And I understand I have both a Sega Genesis and a 32X. It's just recreating territory I already have the ability to do, but honestly, I love projects like this, and I just want to highlight them anytime I can. Now, this is definitely going to be a multi-part video in stages, and I can tell you right now I'm not doing 100% of it on camera. There's so many tiny little resistors, capacitors, and other components. It's mostly microscope work, and that's the type of thing that isn't that fun to shoot. But the 32X and the Sega Neptune and the Sega Genesis are all one in the same piece of hardware. If you pop Streets of Rage 2 into the Sega Neptune, it's going to run just like a Sega Genesis would. If you put the same game into a 32X combo, or Paprium here, because again, had it on camera recently, it does the exact same functionality. You're going to have RGB out of this thing, you're going to have great sound, you're going to have all of the creature comforts of modern Genesis modding. The only thing you don't have is obviously going to be Sega CD support, but it is compatible with it. And honestly, I would want to really definitely plug this thing into an original Sega CD side by side to have the most ridiculously fun setup possible, because Sega CD has a ton of fun games on it. But just so you're aware, before you kind of ask questions down below, it is not a Sega CD. None of the hardware is on board, and I can't even imagine trying to combine all of those into the same PCB, because if you ever actually opened up a Sega CDX, it is the most messy piece of hardware inside you could ever imagine. It's like a prototype just put into a case, in my opinion. But the good thing is the edge here, all of the pads for the Sega CD compatibility with that add-on device is built into the Neptune. So if you put a Model 2 Sega CD right next to the Neptune, you plug it in, it's going to run exactly the same. It has been tested and it does work. Now, taking a look around the PCB here, the number one thing that people are going to recognize, at least off the top, is going to be the Genesis and 32X cartridge slot. It's pretty instantaneously recognizable, because that's where you'd pop in both a Genesis and 32X cart to play on the Neptune. And as far as the overall soldering complexity is concerned, the cartridge slot would be quote-unquote easy. Not to say that it is easy whatsoever, you still need to be able to solder, but the overall pitch of those through holes right there are going to be easy to do by hand. You wouldn't really need a microscope for that either, just tack it in at all four corners, and then carefully solder by hand. Or even some of the other stuff like the Motorola 68000 footprint here, it isn't the worst thing in the world. You could 100% just grab your soldering iron. If you know how to solder and you have enough flex on the board, you're going to basically be able to put this thing back on without really worrying about bridging too many pins or contacts. And just for scale, I put a dime in the middle so you can kind of see the overall pitch for this. This would definitely be one of the easier chips to do by hand, and while all of this is achievable by hand or with a heat gun, there's definitely some components on here that are going to be a lot more difficult to actually solder on. You'll see here one of the pads on one of the chips, if I put the dime back in the middle, all of a sudden the pin pitch on those pads becomes almost minuscule. And again, I use a dime because pretty much everyone knows the size of that, even internationally, so you can kind of start seeing just how difficult and complex of a build this is going to be. And again, it really is probably going to be microscope work, which I don't really love always shooting on camera. Trying to solder when you're looking through a microscope, when you have a camera over your shoulder, and moving your hands at an awkward angle is very difficult, because to get a good camera angle, it is very difficult to actually be able to put my hands where I want to. Definitely will be doing some of this on camera, but I again want you to know it's not going to be every single component, because trust me, 95% of the components on the board are going to be boring capacitors and resistors and everything everything else. But some of the bigger things I will definitely show you here and there. And if you take a look at the bottom corner of the PCB, you're going to see SH2M. That's just going to be one of the secondary SH2s on the 32X, because again, all of the hardware is combined on one PCB like Sega planned it back in the day. And it's super awesome just to see stuff like this actually happening. I can't wait to see this actually running at some point in time in the future, but do not expect it next week or the week after that. You're probably going to be seeing a video once every couple months with progress. I assume this is probably going to take me 6 months or more to actually all string together, and I will probably enlist some help from the modding community and spotlight a modder who I trust just to kind of help me along the way, because remember, I do 14 videos a week, so my time is definitely limited with the rest of my life. Or being able to do stuff like 32X and Sega Genesis on the same board is going to be a ton of fun. And I'm not quite decided on the case yet. You can order the custom Neptune case, and I really like that, but I may just do this in some sort of acrylic as well so I can actually see the PCB. Now up front, if you can't recognize this already, I'll show you what it is in just a moment, but this is the controller area. You'll see here we have the two DB9 ports as well as all of the different filters that would go in on every input. And if we take a look at the PCB next to my CDX, left and right are going to be controller port 1 and 2, and basically every input signal is always going to be filtered in some way, whether it's an arcade board or a console or even a handheld. You definitely just don't raw dog the signal in there like you have no cares in the world. And again, there's a lot of stuff on this board. Kosam did an absolutely outstanding job. Imagine having to route every single trace here and getting it right. I'm sure there was a lot of revisions, but there's not a single bodge wire on this board. All of the routing is elegant. This is a massive amount of work. And just taking a look at the pitch, I think I'm off by 1/10 of a millimeter here, but that is just basically tiny as fuck. And that is what I have to deal with when trying to work on something like this. It's going to be absolutely insane. Of course, it's not just the top of the PCB. There's also a ton of components on the bottom that need to be populated as well. You'll see here all of these little tiny resistors all need to be put on, and they basically all should be put on by hand, at least in my opinion. I could try solder paste and a heat gun, but trying to do that many components at once can be a little bit fiddly, so it is the type of thing, at least me personally, I would probably put them on by hand, or at least if I use solder paste and a gun, basically go space by space and just kind of Kapton tape it out to prevent some of the solder joints from getting undone when I try to heat up another part of the board. But there is just a lot to deal with here, and of course we also need the donor hardware to actually go on this, because you can't just buy these chips off the shelves. This 32X you see here, the backup one I leave on my CDX, is going to become the donor 32X for this project, and I have a couple modded Sega Genesis in the console, but I think I will probably buy just kind of a beater console out there and maybe just go from there, because I do not want to really sacrifice some of my other Genesis in my collection. And again, there is a lot going on here. The fine pitch soldering is no joke. This is extremely fine pitch. Obviously it's not ball grid array, so we have the ability to do this at home without having to deal with ball grid array stencils and jigs and different heat tables. But again, it's going to be requiring a lot of attention. There's so many tiny little components on this board. I guarantee you the first time I try to power it on, it's probably not going to work very well. As long as the magic smoke doesn't escape, though, we'll be okay. And if you're wondering about all the parts on this, there is an interactive BOM or build of materials where you can click around the entire PCB and find out what that exact component is, what it's rated for, what it's doing, whether it's from a sacrificial Sega Genesis or a 32X, or if it's a part that you're just going to be buying off DigiKey. And I think just even putting the order in is going to take about a couple hours. But you saw there on the interactive BOM, I was looking at that SH2M, and that is corresponding to this empty chip space here on the board. So you basically go through that BOM piece by piece by piece, making sure everything is put on and you know exactly what's going there. For capacitors and resistors, it'll have the ratings for them, so you know you're putting on the right pieces. But there are hundreds of bits on this board, and every single one of them needs to be put on correctly, soldered correctly, making sure there's no bridges. And all of those chips, you're going to have to go pin by pin, checking for any sort of continuity that shouldn't be there with solder bridges. And at least for my eyes, that's definitely some microscope work that is going to take a very long time. Stuff like this on the controller port, not too bad whatsoever. You can do that by hand. I could probably zip that out in 5 or 10 minutes. But other parts on the BOM, probably going to take 30-45 minutes to line the chip up, get it tacked down, and get everything else in place. And just think about doing that 15, 20, 25, 30 times on some of the fine pitch components, and you really are talking dozens of hours. So I'll show you some on camera, and I'll do some off camera, and I'll probably get some help as well. But you guys wanted to see a Sega Neptune built on the channel, so many of you asked for it. Honestly, I was kind of sitting on the fence because I knew how much time and energy this project would take, but when you guys asked for something, I try to do it. So definitely hit like and subscribe on this video. If this doesn't do well, I might just end up finishing it in the background and just adding it to my collection and doing a finalized video, because these things, especially setting on camera, take a very long time, so I need to know that it's worth it. But soon, maybe in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, I'll have a working Sega Neptune on the channel. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.